Role-playing games, especially the fantasy variety, have much of their history rooted in tabletop war games. This is partly why they have such an emphasis on fighting, and the role-playing part is often only a justification for the fighting part. Early on, rules were generally kept light and flexible for anything not involving fighting, including traveling across the countryside looking for things to fight. And even now, that's still something typically kept as untouched by the rules as possible. I'm bringing traveling up because I'm about to tell you all about a role-playing game that takes this often overlooked element of role-playing games and makes it into the meat of the game. Ladies and gentlemen and everything in between, I present to you Ryuutama, affectionately known as Hayao Miyazaki's Oregon Trail. Ryuutama is a role-playing game from Japan, and the players are playing as a group of travelers. It uses a standard set of polyhedral dice, and many of the rolls are as simple as rolling a dice or two and trying to meet or beat a certain number. Characters have 4 stats: strength, dexterity, intelligence, and spirit. The number of the stat is what kind of dice you're going to roll when you're checking to see if your character does something properly or not. Trying to do something like eating your weight in hamburgers would be a strength and spirit roll. If you have 4 for strength and 10 for spirit, you'd roll a 4-sided dice and a 10-sided dice. And after rolling, you'd compare it to whatever number the GM says that you need to make, and that would determine whether you succeed or fail. Like in other role-playing games, criticals and fumbles are a thing in this game too. Fumbles happen when all the dice that you roll show 1. That means you fail at whatever you're doing, and maybe some of your equipment gets damaged as well. It's not all bad though, since everybody in the party gains something called a fumble point afterwards. Those can be used to add a +1 to most dice rolls. Criticals, as you'd expect, are kind of the opposite. If both your dice are showing 6, or their highest number value, then you score a critical and succeed automatically at whatever you were trying. So if in the earlier example, if you roll a 4 and a 10, your character actually would be able to eat 100 pounds of hamburgers. As I said earlier, the premise of the game is that you're playing as a group of travelers, and the rules are designed pretty much around that specifically. The bulk of the game is played through what are known as the traveling rules. The traveling rules are a series of rolls that the party goes through to determine how things go on their journey, and they cover things like how well everybody feels when they wake up, if they manage to travel safely through the day, if they got lost, and if they set up a decent enough camp for the night. They're basically meant to take you through a day in the life of your traveling party. Though, there's something very important to keep in mind about the travel rules. While at their core, they're just a series of rolls like the ones I described earlier, the fun of this game comes from determining just what exactly the dice mean and describing how it happened. At the start of a day, everyone makes a condition check using strength and spirit. And let's say you roll a total of 3. That has a meaning beyond just how easily susceptible you are to status ailments that day. It meant something kept you awake at night, or maybe you just didn't feel well for some reason when you woke up. Another one of the travel rolls is simply called the travel check, and it's based off your strength and dexterity. Failing it causes you to lose half your HP. But something had to cause it, and somebody might have a reaction to seeing it happen. Basically, anytime you roll, you should use the result as a prompt for role-playing. If you fail at navigation, instead of just saying that your movement rate for that day is halved, your character might say something like, "Oops, I was holding the map upside down that time." Or another good example is the camp check, based off your dexterity and intelligence. And let's say you just have a really low score for those, but you still succeed at the camping check despite that. Your character then might say something like, "Oh hey, look, I managed to set the camp up without lighting the tent on fire." It might seem a little awkward if you're not used to that sort of thing, but if you don't do it, the game really just becomes a series of meaningless rolls where you're just trying to see if probability is or isn't in your favor, and that can honestly get kind of boring. While it's not a big part of it, this game does have combat. So if you're accustomed to having that in your games or think that the inclusion of fighting could make the journey more interesting, don't worry, you're not going to be left wanting. Combat is left relatively simple in this game, and much of it is left to the imagination. There's not a whole lot of difference in different weapons, and there isn't a million different combat abilities that can be used. In fact, you don't even need some giant battle grid to keep track of what's going on. There's a simple sheet that's used to help organize everything going on in a battle. The combat rules are kept nice and simple too, so you can add as much descriptive flair to your attacks as you want, without getting bogged down with questions like, "Can the rules allow me to do a backflip before I smash that monster with my axe?" Or, "Do I need a special ability to trip the bandit and then stab him while he's on the ground?" You just say what it is you want to attempt to do and roll for it. If you roll well, then it worked magnificently. If you roll poorly, then evidently what your character was trying to do wasn't a very good idea. This game isn't without some downsides and complexities though. Inventory management is an important part of this game, and it isn't one that can be easily abstracted or ignored like in other games. It's a game about traveling where combat can actually be excluded entirely. So to that end, there has to be a challenge somewhere, and that's why inventory management can't be ignored. It's hardly a challenge to travel across the countryside if you never have to worry about food or water, especially if it's a peaceful countryside. Though on the flip side, if combat does happen, needing to avoid carrying too much can be made all the more treacherous if you have to decide between your food or your incapacitated friends. Anyways, inventory management. While it can be kind of a drag, it does add something to this game. And it's not all that bad though. It's simply a matter of keeping the total size of everything you're carrying beneath your carrying capacity. And the numbers are pretty small in that regard. The last thing I want to talk about in this game is something that's a little odd. It's something I've never seen in any role-playing game before, for that matter. The GM gets a character in this game. I don't know enough about Japan's gaming culture to really comment on why a Japanese game allows something like that, but at least in the West, when the game master has a character, that's generally a taboo. So I'm just going to take this aspect of the game at face value. The GM gets a character in this game. I guess it kind of goes along with the lore of the game world though. The GM's character is a Ryuutama, or dragon person. They record the tales of travelers, which are then fed to young dragons so that they can grow up and, well, do dragony things in this universe. And to make those stories more interesting, the Ryuutama that the GM plays has unique powers that they can use to interfere with what's going on in the game, which kind of implies that the GM isn't supposed to deviate too much from what the rulebook says their role in the game is. And just like any other typical character in an RPG, the GM's character also levels up, giving them more powers. The alien nature of it all aside, it's kind of an interesting touch, and kind of works if you assume the GM is supposed to keep their interfering with the game events to a minimum. So in a nutshell, Ryuutama is a fantasy RPG that pretty thoroughly inverts everything about fantasy RPGs, and in some cases RPGs in general. It's simple enough to facilitate role-playing, but has enough definition and restriction to give it an identity. It does a good job of achieving the goal of what it sets out to be, a lighthearted role-playing game about a group of travelers. If you're looking for a game that'd be good to play with people who are new to role-playing games, or just want a simpler game with less rules that get in the way, you should really give Ryuutama a try. If you like this video, click the little thumbs up button. You can also subscribe if you haven't done that yet. With all that said, I am Schaedel, and I will see you all next time.